Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, that miracle that happened, that one time. And this is Episode 45, The Civil War Begins, Reluctantly. And we have the talents of Arctic Acoustic joining us today. Thank you for the music. You were last on the program, Episode 3, the one about anthropology, the lineages of modernity. He's better known around here for his musical talent, but he is an inventor, entrepreneur, and a leader in the technical side of the world.
Hi, glad to be back. Great show. I can't really get enough of that intro music.
We covered how Charles had to call the Long Parliament in 1640 to get funds to pay off the Scottish Covenanters' army. As long as that army was in England, Parliament was the supreme power of the land. The experiment with ship money, which seemed so promising to fans of divine right monarchy anyway, failed when the English simply stopped paying. Parliament quickly enacted a huge program of reform, reflecting the growing demands of the political nation. They impeached Archbishop Laud and Wentworth, Earl Stafford. Laud was the king's closest advisor and the head of the church, and Wentworth was the king's most able servant. And back in the day, impeachment meant death, by the way. Charles promised that he would not agree to Wentworth's death, but he wasn't really a promise keeper, so Wentworth was executed in May 1641. Starting to see the problem? Other ministers fled the country. Parliament changed the Constitution, removing the king's ability to dissolve Parliament. Now Parliament could sit when it wanted, and this was a revolutionary constitutional measure, but also a necessary financial one. They needed to raise money, and that meant they needed to borrow. And only Parliament inspired the confidence of creditors. All the non-parliamentary taxes of the period of personal rule were cancelled. Convictions against Charles's opponents were overturned, mainly printers, writers, and tax resistors. And these people joyfully returned to London from prison, hailed as heroes. Hail the conquering pamphlet printer. The prerogative courts, including Star Chamber, were abolished. Parliament took control over all the king's money except from his personal lands. He could not even afford to pay his personal household for a time. In frustration, Queen Henrietta Maria even wrote the Pope asking for money. I love the way Paul Johnson writes about this. How the old pontiff must have laughed when he asked, had Charles been born? Didn't he know that popes do not give money? They took it. So there you go. The king's power to arbitrarily imprison was ended, and the king's power to tax arbitrarily was ended. Most of the policy demands of the English political nation were satisfied. So get that? They got everything they wanted. Mainly, the Scottish religious issues were solved, right? The king just caved. The Scottish army paid off. So that should have avoided the crisis. Everyone could go home and live happily ever after.
There were a few thorny issues still. Parliament and the Scots agreed to get rid of bishops and establish a Presbyterian church in England as a national church. That's naturally a very complicated thing.
True, the agreed move to a Presbyterian church had widespread Puritan support, but already we can see dedicated Anglicans peeling off Parliament's side to support the king. We don't want to change our church this way. We like it the way it is. And this is the point where Cardinal Richelieu, the head of government in France, advised Charles to stay quiet, do nothing. And the majority of the landed power, the majority of the merchants who wanted peace, would gradually come back to his side. This was good advice.
It sounds as if keep calm and carry on was his advice to Charles.
And it might have worked. Charles married his young daughter Mary to Prince William of Orange. Don't forget this. A popular marriage, as William was known as a good Protestant. Though he was still only 15 at the time, it's a good reminder to the people that they had a king who knew how to do king stuff like advantageous royal marriages, even if he seemed terrible at everything else. But this did not take into account the Irish. Free from the iron rule of Wentworth, when all this was going on, They rose up in rebellion and started slaughtering the English and Protestants thoroughly and methodically. No one left alive. They raped women by the thousand, tortured small children, dismembered grannies with axes, cut off people's private parts, boiled heads, tossed Protestants kicking and screaming into massive bonfires, and laughed at the screams. They mutilated them with knives. And many of the Irish rebels had warrants from the king to seize Protestant land, goods, and persons.
No, I think I would have heard of something so terrible.
This is at least how the event was understood in England and Scotland. And so, this is an important part of history because it affected the minds of the time. I'll tell you that many hundreds, possibly a couple thousand, were killed in horrific ways. It wasn't quite the apocalyptic vision of hell that was painted at the time, but obviously it was pretty bad. But generally the Protestants were able to shelter in their towns and areas where they had strong militias. And of course, Charles never approved of the rebellion, never gave warrants or commissions, but the claim was out there. Parliament immediately agreed to raise money for an army to send to Ireland. And now we are at the vital juncture. We've had 5 episodes of Stuart failure and farce, evil. Every attempt at war, a failure. And now the king needs an army to go to Ireland. This is hard to understand, but people like Pym were saying that all this incompetence is just too much incompetence to believe. It's a conspiracy. Bad luck? Way too much bad luck. Only a deliberate conspiracy could explain all this failure. And what was the conspiracy? To get the king an army. And why would the king go to all these lengths to get an army? To rule over them all despotically, like the French and the Spanish, to steal their rights, to establish absolute personal rule, to bring back the Catholic Church. We cannot trust the king with an army. Charles was actually up in Scotland, where he was still king when the Irish revolt broke out, mending fences. He listened to a Presbyterian service at St. Giles, which had been the center of the rebellion against him. He was building support again. After all, he gave the rebels everything they wanted. But he was plotting to reassert authority again. According to Alan Massey, Charles felt like he had given in to the Scots under threat of force, so he did not have to keep any of the promises he made as soon as he was strong enough to break them. And here's the nub of my 4th cause of the Civil War. How can you get a peaceful constitutional settlement with a king who won't keep promises? He should have read the story of Odin and the frost giant mason. Just a little explanatory digression here. When Charles starts talking about how he's not morally obligated to live up to promises he makes under threat of force, Charles failed to understand what Louis XIV understood. Kings were creatures of force. Ratio ultima regnum, the last argument of kings, was embossed on his cannon. An ordinary person might not feel obligated to keep agreements made by force or under threat of force, but a king definitely needed to, because a king is a creature of force. Else the logical contradictions pile up so high they need to be chopped down. I hope this is clear. End of digression. Now, Parliament was going to raise an army, but can Charles be trusted to command it? John Pym and his allies in Parliament said the king could not be allowed to command an army. What if the conspiracy were real?
You don't need a conspiracy. Remember episode 43. Charles is like a reverse Midas when it comes to war. Everything he touches turns to shit and death.
Charles could not accept this. Was he a king at all if he was not in command of the army, militia, and navy? This is a major question for royalists at the time. More and more people in Parliament began to see Pym and his allies as extremists, and they started supporting the king. Because obviously the king commands the army, but we can't trust him. But now, I'm not sure I trust you, Pym. So support for Pym and the radicals was starting to ebb away. And sensing this, Pym put together a document called the Grand Remonstrance. The Grand Remonstrance. 200 clauses, recalling all the faults and tyrannies of Charles's period of personal rule. The most controversial part of it was that crown ministers should serve at the pleasure of Parliament. And if the king refused to sign it, Parliament should put down the rebellion in Ireland itself, excluding the king. The Grand Remonstrance passed, but only by 11 votes. So obviously the tides were shifting against Pym, now often called King Pym at this time, and towards Charles. Parliament was raising taxes to pay the Scots and all the new expenses. And no one likes that. All this theorizing is fun, but you want me to pay how much? Opinion was shifting. The narrowness of the vote meant that the king now had a sizable party in Parliament where before he had really nothing. But could Charles be patient, as Richelieu recommended? The city of London held elections in December, a month after the Grand Remonstrance, and the results were very favorable to the Puritan cause. So the king appointed one of his most violent partisans to command the Tower of London, as if preparing for violence against Parliament and/or the city. And there were rumors of plots flying thick. The London mob, sometimes supported by sailors, threatened to kill any bishops that came to sit in the House of Lords. And the bishops were a big enough voting bloc to keep the House of Lords on the king's side. The bishops physically could not attend Parliament, and without them, the king's party lost the votes. The militia was called out by Parliament without any authority of the king. This was technically treason, but no one seemed to care. Another name for the London militia was the trained bands, by the way. Charles now attempted to impeach 5 members of the House of Commons, including Pym and Lord Mandeville. Impeachments were performed by the House of Lords. The charges were treasonable correspondence with the Scots during the recent crisis, and Pym and the new Puritan-dominated London Council prepared an act of dramatic theater in response. The next day, January 4th, the 5 men took their seats in Parliament in the early afternoon, knowing that the king would be informed that they were there. And sure enough, with 300 armed guards, the king entered Parliament, leaving the door open so all could see the armed force outside. Charles walked in alone and asked for the charged members to be surrendered to him. What was Cardinal Richelieu's advice again? Never mind, we're ignoring that. But the 5 members had slipped out, and the king asked for help finding the 5, but he was refused. People there describe a long pause and a dreadful silence. And the king said, "Since all the birds are flown, I do expect from you that you will send them on to me when they return hither. If not, I will seek them for myself, for their treason is foul. But I assure you, on the word of a king, I never did intend any force, but shall proceed against them in a legal and fair way, for I never meant any other."
In other words, who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes?
Yeah, members started shouting, "Privilege, privilege!" and the king left. That night, London was like an armed camp. Barricades and chains blocked all the major roadways. Imagine Les Mis, Paris in the 1830s, and you have it. The suburbs as well as the city offered support to Parliament. Housewives boiled water, ready to throw down on any royal guards. The king decided to abandon London a few days later, and he never returned again, except as a captive. He called his loyal supporters to him. Out of fear or stupidity, both? We'll never know. Therefore, with his strongest supporters away, the majority in both houses were solidly with Pym and against Charles. And when Parliament asked him to return a few days later, he said he did not feel safe, and he headed for Royalist York instead of rebel London. And it was about this time that Hull, with the National Armoury, was closed to the king. And Parliament proclaimed itself the supreme ruler of the land. That's handy. They commanded loyal people all over England to take control of their localities, and they proceeded to horrify those same localities by raising taxes again to fund a new army. And no one except maybe Pym and his close allies wanted a civil war at this point. Everyone assumed negotiation could be worked out. The king's supporters urged him to give Parliament an olive branch everywhere he went. They just did not want to fight and die for him. No one wanted a war. Nevertheless, both king and Parliament raised armies. The fleet, in almost its entirety, was for Parliament. The few royalist gentlemen captains were replaced directly, kindly or unkindly, but immediately. So the armies are raised, but not necessarily intending to fight. They were as much to deter the other side and support negotiations. Like I said before, a game of chicken. The first real battle was not until October, the Battle of Edgehill, a draw provoked because Charles was trying to move on London. The parliamentary side was commanded by the Earl of Essex.
Was that the same Earl of Essex whose divorce from Frances Howard depended on erectile dysfunction?
The same one whose pecker was at issue in episode 40.
His reputation was trashed so the king's lover could marry his wife. No wonder he fought against the king.
Remember, the great question of that day was whether his pole was bewitched or failed of its own accord. And finally, for the sake of his future marriage prospects, it was proven that a witch did it. But Essex was the highest-ranking nobleman on the Parliament side. That's why he was in command, but he was never competent. You can see the mistake Parliament is making here, that they would eventually rectify with promotion by merit. Nothing really resulted from this battle, but it does illustrate the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides. The Royalists had excellent, but fatally flawed cavalry, as you would expect from a force that was mainly filled by noblemen's and gentry sons. They were practiced in horsemanship and brave to a fault. They had officers that had served in the 30 Years' War in Dutch and Swedish service. Actually, both sides did. The parliamentary cavalry was trained in the Dutch drill to fire carbines and pistols from the saddle. The Royalists charged Swedish style, relying on shock and weight. The Swedish style was the best style. And the Royalist cavalry defeated Parliament's cavalry on both wings at the battle, but uselessly, because they then rode off the battlefield to raid the baggage train and get loot. Meanwhile, the battle was going on, and their horses were blown. Horses recover only slowly.
They sound like Vikings instead of soldiers.
Yes, these high-born young men, they were willing warriors of some kind, but not soldiers. In the center, some of the parliamentary infantry just ran away, seeing their cavalry defeated. But the parliamentary army still had some cavalry in the center, and in several charges scattered much of the royalist infantry, which, compared to Parliament's infantry, were poorly equipped. Not enough armor, not enough weapons. Basically, it all boiled down to not enough money. Money, the sinews of war. But the parliamentary infantry was well equipped. They had enough money. And some of the units were largely Puritan, and they would stay and fight all day long. Brave as lions, if lions are plain and simple people. The Royalist infantry was able to hold on through the day, with, in particular, some very brave Yorkshiremen holding the line against superior numbers and cavalry attacks. The parliamentary artillery was reasonably effective. The Royalist artillery was poorly placed and poorly commanded. It was not effective. Afterwards, the king tried resuming the march on London, but between Essex's army and the trained bands of London, he was so heavily outnumbered he retreated. This retreat is controversial. Some would have it that the king could have slaughtered the militia and then turned on Essex and then won the war, as if he were Napoleon with a central position concept. Others that the king was merciful upon his people. But I think we know something when we see the king was low on gunpowder and outnumbered 2-1. The amount of popular support for the parliamentary cause, the middle class, what people at the time called the middling sort, meant that Parliament would have the numbers. The support of London and the Southeast and Midlands meant that Parliament would have the money too, and their more numerous troops would be well equipped. The weakness of the cavalry would be fixed by Oliver Cromwell. A little training in the Swedish style, a little recruiting of dedicated Puritans who, quote, had the heart of the matter, unquote, i.e., they had that moment of grace which informed you that you were one of the elect. While they were merely men, a psalm-singing Puritan cavalry, trained to the highest pitch, superbly equipped, totally dedicated to the day, were essentially invincible. European military observers were nearly unanimous about this. Don't go to war with these guys. Just don't. The infantry would also drill to a high professional level. Their weapons would continue to improve, and they would get their red coats. And the new model army would run on the basis of merit rather than birth. And let's face it, that's so obviously a superior way to do things. The Royalists really had no chance once the new model army took it upon themselves to actually try and win the war. Supply and communications were professionalized. Some thought, and a few still think, the Swedes would have been a match for the new model army, but with that possible exception, we're looking at the finest military in the world at this time. Too bad, Charles. Tough luck. But not really. He believed birth was more important than actual skill, knowledge, dedication, intelligence, and grit. Of course, courage is important, and most of the nobles and gentry were insanely brave. We think gentry supported the king by a 2-to-1 ratio. But on the battlefield, they were often not intelligent tactically, and often had priorities other than winning the fucking battle. And that just wasn't fixable. The obsession with birth, who your parents are determines who you are, prevented the talented from rising. Self-sabotage, not fixable. And the royalist money problems, also not fixable. I think the main thing was reluctance to fight, or possibly reluctance to kill. Here is my theme from episode 25 with Raoul Sunset returning again. England was minimally murdery, relative to everywhere else in the 17th century. Constant flows of petitions and appeals for negotiated peace. There were constant suggestions from within both sides to just surrender and trust the other side to come up with an acceptable solution, rather than continue the war. Imagine a civil war run on that basis, with so many people being pretty sane, high-minded Christians, saying things like, "Wouldn't it be cool if we could just stop fighting each other?" You'll find some histories of the war ignore this underlying element.
Have you been smoking your socks? Do you have an unsuspected hippie side? That just sounds wrong. If no one wanted to fight, why were they fighting?
First of all, I love you smuggling in that Norwegian expression about smoking your socks. Maybe we'll talk about that with Cammy. You're basically saying I'm crazy. Well, remember where we were in history. Parliament wanted to limit the powers of the king, but still keep the crown as an important part of the government. The people wanted to keep a king, period. This seems to be a really well-established fact. But the thinking people wanted the crown subordinate to Parliament, much like what eventually occurred in the 1714 settlement. The king was willing to yield some, but not all that.
That's a gross oversimplification. There were Puritan anxieties over religion. How can a king like Charles, who tried personal rule, be trusted? There's the clarity of the idea of royal sovereignty, with no theory of liberty of the people to oppose it. There was a loss of legitimacy, court versus country, meddling in ordinary life by the church. You have given us very good reasons for war.
Except for the not trusting Charles part, most of those reasons have been addressed and solved, at least as far as the vast majority were concerned. Although it probably didn't land with everyone yet. There's not really enough left unsolved to fight a bloody civil war over, but both sides made terrible mistakes that hardened hearts. Charles might have had very tepid support, except that Parliament declared in September 1642 that anyone supporting the king was liable to have their property seized, and that made reluctant supporters of the king more firm. Parliament seemed to make this flavor of mistake a lot, pointless signaling that turned people against them. But the king also made mistakes like this. The king's nephew, Rupert, I think he was only 23 years old, but already an experienced leader in the 30 Years' War, did some plundering on the approach to London. And Peter Ackroyd says that the word plundering entered common usage at that time. So, some hate grew.
They hated Charles because Rupert plundered?
A king should not plunder his own people, remember. The whole point of a king is justice. And then there's London itself and the port cities, which were hotbeds of sectarianism. The radical forms of Puritanism, you might also say. They were suddenly free to converse and publish and meet openly when the Laudian censorship broke down in 1640. There'll be a special episode about these guys soon. Their numbers seemed to grow rapidly. They were for radical social change. They had ideas like one man, one vote democracy, abolish the House of Lords, no nobility, no kings, sharing out property, ending the legal privileges of gentry, allowing easy divorce, no state church. These were the Muggletonians, Grindletonians, Ranters, Diggers, Levelers, Socinians, Bahamites, and Fifth Monarchists.
Muggletonians, Grindletonians, Ranters. Who came next? The Gryffindorians?
Well, those names had to come from somewhere. Many had ideas that we would recognize as ones we mostly hold today and were popular with young apprentices in London and other towns. And they and the gentry might hate each other over these ideas. Just a little flame of hate that kept the war going, just barely hot enough. Another thing to understand is that the war sucked. Trade declined, people were poorer. Everyone wanted the war to end except some of the soldiers, who common people thought were deliberately prolonging the war. There were some interesting slurs about armies marching in the wrong direction because the right direction might end the war. But there was pillaging and soldiers living in private houses and poor harvests, which were crucial to the failure of the economy at the time. In Parliament itself, you read about a growing win the war party, implying that much of Parliament was not part of the win the war party. Now, these would be people like Cromwell who actually wanted to win and took positive steps in that direction. And you would normally assume this was everyone, right? But it was not the majority. It took a long time for the self-denying ordinance to be passed, April 1645. This took away army commissions from members of Parliament like Essex, and this would allow a fully meritocratic new model army. And Cromwell and a handful of others too valuable to the war effort were exempted. And that was one of the serious steps towards a meritocratic army, away from one based on social rank. And the new model army was first taking the field at that time too. Once the new model army was in place, well financially supported by Parliament, there was no way they could fail to win. Officers were appointed on the basis of efficiency, and overwhelmingly, this was an army led by radical Puritans, what we would call independents. First, Cromwell and the radicals had to prove they could win. Cromwell trained up a cavalry regiment from the Midlands, nicknamed Ironsides by Rupert. Psalm-singing Puritans, straight-laced as anything, they concentrated on fighting, winning, and would relax with a nice prayer, a psalm sing-along, or a Bible reading. If they swore, they were fined. If they got drunk, they were severely punished. Mainly, they concentrated on fighting and trying to do that as well as it could be done. It was actually a double-sized regiment and was obviously highly effective with many successes. And they proved themselves in a big, public, take-notice world kind of way at Marston Moor in 1644.
But wait, how could they avoid alcohol on campaign, with water as unreliable as it was in those days?
No one could. Rations for common soldiers were pretty good. 1 bottle of wine per day or 2 bottles of beer, 2 pounds of bread and 1 pound of meat or cheese. I think that what they meant by drunk was more like what we would say roaring drunk or insensible. That's punishable. Not merely downing a bottle of wine, which you had to do in order to live. In order to supply thousands of men with that much wine and beer, there had to be huge supplies of it around nearly all the time. So getting drunk in their sense of the word would require breaking into some of those supplies.
Okay, then drunk is one of those English words with many meanings. English should get simplified. Sometimes you use one word to mean 10 things, and sometimes you have 10 words that mean the same thing. And even if you find the right word, there's like 7 different ways of pronouncing it.
Sure, granted, English is weird, but Norwegian has a lot of dialects too. You and I both know someone who is highly skilled at identifying which particular hamlet or valley someone is from in Uland by careful listening to subtle variations in pronunciation. Okay, back to Marston Moor. It was a battle like many others in the Civil War. Both sides were not really well prepared for it to start. Half the men on both sides ran away as soon as the fighting got to them. The Royalists on one flank, also known as Cavaliers, on one flank were victorious and then sort of disappeared as usual, looking for plunder, making themselves useless. Meanwhile, Cromwell's Roundheads, with the Ironsides cavalry, won the battle on the other flank. But then Rupert, personally commanding the Royalist reserves, his very best forces, counterattacked, but was destroyed. The Ironsides kept their discipline. Then they turned on the Royalist infantry in the center and rode them down, winning a great battle. Within the battle, Cromwell's cavalry basically had 3 victories. First, against the opposing forces on their side of the battle line, then against the Royalist reserves. The very best Royalist cavalry, brave sons of nobility and gentry, well fed and equipped, and fighting under their best, most inspiring commander. It was a hard fight, but the middling men beat them. Third, against the Royalist infantry in the center. The whole thing took just a couple of hours. Boom. "Ah, so this is how you win. I see it now. Okay, Cromwell, get going. Organize a whole army for us and win the war." Except it took 9 months of bickering within Parliament to decide they actually wanted to win the war above all their other concerns. One famous example to express this, the Earl of Manchester, Cromwell's nominal superior at Marston Moor, said, "If we beat the king 99 times, he is king still, and so be his posterity after him. If he beat us but once, we shall all be hanged, and our posterity be made slaves." This was an argument for caution, for not losing. As a statement, if true, it was a better logical argument for not starting a war at all. Those who wanted a negotiated peace and those who wanted victory finally began to see and understand each other. "Ah, there you are. I see you now." Next week, I think we wrap up the Civil War and get into the intense conflicts between the Presbyterians and Independents. As usual, it all starts with skirts. And thanks, Arctic Acoustic. Glad to have you and your socks on the program.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
All right, we just finished episode 45 with Arctic Acoustic. Cami, any reactions?
It's always good to hear from our family in Norway, and our Arctic Acoustic is a lot of fun. The Irish Revolt, that uprising that you detailed as being so horrific, rape and murder and torture, and how long did that last?
Oh, that was a big one. I mean, it got started in 1641, lasted until Cromwell put it down in 1650.
I had no idea it was such a long time span.
Oh, and it went crazy. I mean, there were 5 armies functioning at one time, I think I mentioned in the episode, including one led by the papal nuncio, and they represented all kinds of different interests and viewpoints, and of course many local militias. That long war, including Cromwell's intervention later, ended up creating deaths and injuries in about 40% of the Irish population. So it was horrifically bloody, horrible series of years.
So that was actually going on the same time as the king and parliament had their war going on.
Yeah, and that's what brought it to the ultimate boiling point where they just couldn't agree. I mean, of course, the whole thing in Ireland was blown up to be bigger than it was, right? I gave those examples of the way the story was told rather than what the reality was, but it was this widespread belief that something horrible and hideous was happening, and somehow we just couldn't get our act together to send an army over there because the king couldn't be trusted to have one under his command.
Wow, amazing. It went on for so long.
Yeah, a nightmare, a disaster for Ireland.
So we have the king and parliament both raising arms, the royalists who are with the king, the Puritans who are with parliament, and then we have the new model army come out of this.
Yeah, they were a deliberate creation, and they tended to be staffed by the Independents, which were sort of a smaller radical wing of the Puritans.
Right,
But they were radical in the sense that they were radically tolerant. So they were radical in an interesting direction.
I can see that being a motivator for the troops. If I do well, I rise up in the army, rather than the old way of the gentry and the high-ups keeping control.
Yeah, especially for the officers. And
they
went out there, their battle cry was, God and our strength.
I can see that new model army under Cromwell as being a great motivator, a way to get ahead in life rather than, purely station of birth kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a far superior way to do things than have everything depend on whatever characteristics you're born with.
And then I have to say I was a bit amused when you talked about how half the armies on each side would run away when they actually got to their battle.
Yeah, that was pretty common.
Well, I know it was common, but me and my grandma had pictured the 2.5-year-old when he runs around the house saying, "Run away, run away." I'm sorry, it distracted me for a minute, that picture of our cute little one. I mean, I know this was not fun and cute at battle, but that's his phrase, "Run away, run away." So I'm sorry, couldn't help it. I gotta say, I know part of why I enjoy our Norwegian family so much. Phrases like smoking your socks.
Oh, yeah.
I gotta remember that one. I can see I can use that one around the house a little bit when I think you're a little bit off or crazy. I'll have to use that, and everyone else will just look at me like I'm crazy. But,
Yeah, that's a good one.
I think that's a good one. I have to admit, I had to look up some more of these phrases. And I have another one I think I might have to use.
Okay.
At home.
All right.
And that's to sit with your beard in the post box. But to sit with your beard in the post box is to have ended up in a stupid situation that you may have cheated your way into. I know my husband doesn't cheat his way into things, but I love the phrase. Sit with your beard in the post box.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we probably find ourselves in bizarre situations in life sometimes and wonder, how did I get here? What did I do wrong to get here?
Maybe it could be used when it's not a cheating, but just doing something stupid is what I think of.
Yeah.
So your comments about Parliament bickering for 9 months about whether they wanted to actually win the war. Bit intriguing there. I mean, they enter a war, they get into the war, and they bicker about it.
Yes, but, you kind of get into a war by accident, and that was the picture I was trying to paint of nobody really wanting a war, but you have these armies, you march on London, and then you don't want to let the king march on London, and so you start fighting battles, and once battles are fought, temperatures go up, people do stupid things like Rupert plundering and like Parliament threatening to take away the land of anybody that supported the king, which they did do, by the way.
Kind of gets into a downward spiral, so to speak.
Yeah, so they end up with a full-blown civil war, not as horrible as what was going on in Ireland, for sure. In England, I think about 3.5% of the population became casualties during the war compared to 40% in Ireland. So, not nearly so horrific, but still it was really bad. And it wasn't a war that was willed by either side.
Not willed by either side.
By either side, yeah. They mostly just wanted to have a negotiated settlement with Charles. And negotiated settlement could be done, from kind of any perspective. But the Win the War party decided, we're going to crush the king's army. We're going to take him captive as a person and hold him. And then, if we want to negotiate with him, we can negotiate with him. But it's going to be from a position of total strength. We're done fighting. We want to stop the fighting. The only way to stop the fighting is just to win. Just, very simple, plain thinking that was completely right on.
Well, it sounds to me like Charles got into a position where he was to sit with his beard in the post box.
Oh, yes. Charles definitely had his beard in the post box. Great. Thank you, Cammie. We'll talk to you next week.
Hopefully sooner.
Yeah, we'll be here next week.
If you like the podcast, please tell a friend about it. If you don't, please tell an enemy.